British Prime Minister Boris Johnson faced yet more anger from members of Parliament earlier as he fielded questions in the House of Commons about his leadership as the row continues over parties at his offices in Downing Street. Reports suggest Mr. Johnson is on the brink of facing a leadership challenge after an angry backlash over claims parties were held at his residence during coronavirus lockdowns. The Prime Minister denied an accusation by his former advisor that he had lied to Parliament about one party. However, this has failed to quell widespread outrage. As many as 20 Conservative lawmakers who won their seats at the last general election in 2019 plan to submit letters of no confidence in Johnson. So far, there have been claims of more than 14 parties allegedly breaching lockdown rules at either Downing Street, the Cabinet Office or government ministries.
I suspect there's lots of colleagues who are reflecting on what they've heard in their constituencies and are feeling under a lot of pressure right now because the British public are absolutely furious with what they've heard. Our boss is not the Prime Minister. Our boss is those who send us to Westminster to represent us, and they are furious at what they have heard. And so it doesn't surprise me in the slightest that every single member of the government, every single member of the party is balancing those two loyalties. I just think that the Prime Minister has given his account of things. He did so at the dispatch box, which all ministers take very seriously, that when they stand up at the dispatch box, they have a responsibility to be absolutely accurate in what they say. Others have contested that version of events and have said they're willing to do so on oath. We all wait to see what Sue Gray has heard and the conclusions that she makes.
And we can cross now to Layla Johnson Salami, who's at Downing Street. Good afternoon, Layla. As we saw earlier, the pressure is building on Boris Johnson, but he actually looked like he was really ready to fight.
Absolutely, how we saw a very defending Boris Johnson today, very different from the Boris Johnson that we saw at the last PMQs. Like you said, he was ready to come out and fight and defend himself. He was insisting, as we expected, on not coming forward with anything to say until the inquiry that's being carried out, or the investigation that's being carried out by Sue Gray, is complete. Now, this is a very different or change in the tune from what we heard from Boris Johnson at the last PMQs, a Boris Johnson who was more remorseful, a Boris Johnson who was more apologetic. And the question is why? Now, it's very clear that Boris Johnson, if he is going down, is not going to go down without a fight. And I think he's made that clear to Parliament today and clear to the public today as well. However, that's not to say that things necessarily went well for him in Parliament today. I would say that one of the key takeaways that we had from Parliament would have been MP David Davis stepping forward and saying that even though he supported the Prime Minister, especially with the success of Brexit, that the Prime Minister should resign. Now, this was humiliation right from his very own bench. We also know that earlier on today we had a defection from the Tory party into the Labour Party, and that was Christian Wakeford, an MP from Bury South, and he was sitting there on the Labour bench, something that Keir Starmer was very proud of and made clear that he was very proud of. So yes.
And Layla, this is a bad time for Johnson, like you say, absolute humiliation. And on top of this political scandal, figures released earlier today show that UK inflation hit a near 30-year high, and millions of households could see a 50% hike in energy bills in April. Can Boris Johnson hang on?
That's a very good question. Bad news that came out this morning, like you said, about inflation reaching a 30-year high. And this is very damning for Boris Johnson and the Tory party, because obviously this is coming at a very, very tough time. Can Boris Johnson hang on is a question that can't necessarily be answered yet, but we do know that this doesn't necessarily position him well, which may be why we did see Boris Johnson trying to really hammer on in Parliament today about the successes of his government around the pandemic, etc. Because look, the pressure is on the Bank of England to really raise interest rates to cool spending and lower inflation. But at the same time, the dilemma is that you don't want to squeeze household budgets too far and then undermine the recovery process as well. So there's certainly a lot that's going on right now. And the Partygate scandal just sitting at the top of everything really doesn't necessarily help matters, or doesn't help matters at all.
Well, Layla, we've heard what politicians really think about Boris Johnson, but would like to know what the national mood is like.
That's a very good question as well. The national mood is fury. A lot of people across the UK are completely furious. The pandemic hit the world bad, but it hit the UK extremely, extremely badly. And a lot of people lost their loved ones. To think that right here in number 10, right behind me, while people were at home and listening to the restrictions and the guidelines put out by this very government, that inside the walls of this building, those guidelines and restrictions were not being followed. It's absolutely absurd to a majority of the British public. And you can see that in the polls as well, and you can see that in the response. And this is very, very tricky for Boris Johnson, because let's not forget that his relationship with the Tory party, it's a pretty transactional one. At the end of the day, Boris Johnson is someone who, let's say that his key character trait when it comes to politics is electability. And if you don't have that electability, then you don't really have much to go on. And to be someone who is electable, the public have to like you. And the polls are not looking great for him at all. I'll give you an example. A YouGov poll that came out before his apology, this was before Boris Johnson's apology, saw Labour having a 10-point lead over the Tories. And this was the highest or largest gap that YouGov have seen since December 2013. So Boris Johnson losing that one character trait that the Tory party rely on is not great for him at all. I'd also like to just go back to the story quickly on inflation and touch on that again. I had a conversation earlier on today with a taxi driver who had been out of work for 13 months during the pandemic because he simply was in a high-risk category and he could not go out and do his job. He was mentioning how he gets back on the streets, back to riding, and all of a sudden he can't feed his family. He can't keep up with his day-to-day. He goes into Asda today and tomorrow the prices have gone up. And you can see that this is really, really affecting people, and people are really, really worried about the increase in gas prices that's to come as well. So right now, a lot of people are furious. As I came into Downing Street today, just outside the gates, you had several people there with signboards, several people who were shouting that Boris Johnson must resign. The question is he going to listen to the British public and the course of public opinion? Knowing Boris Johnson, it doesn't necessarily seem like he will. And we saw that in Parliament today with how defensive he was over his actions. Regardless of how mocked he was getting in Parliament, he did not stand down, and he continued to push on one point, which is that we're going to wait for Sue Gray to finish with her inquiry before I say anything else. He's also refused to answer questions on whether that means if the inquiry comes out and does find him to be guilty of certain things, if he's going to resign then. He's refused to answer questions on that as well. So you can see that this is a man who is willing to stay in office no matter what it takes. And quite frankly, it's very worrying for many people, because a lot of people are wondering where the remorse actually is. At the end of the day, if certain activities were going on within the walls of your space and within your house, and you want to claim that you didn't know that these were parties and you thought that they were work events, then a lot of people look at it as a big slap in the face. Are you saying that people can't see through that? So Boris Johnson has a tough road ahead of him, and so does the Tory party as well, because quite frankly, we know that local elections are coming up later on this year. General elections may not be for another 2 years, but the Tory party are not going to want someone fronting their party that is not liked by the British public. So how exactly is he going to turn this around? Well, I guess the thing is, we're going to have to wait for that investigation to come out before we can make any further judgments on exactly how this is going to go, because this is heavy politics that's being played here. A man who literally switched from being apologetic and not necessarily, obviously not admitting to what had happened and saying he had no knowledge. He said he categorically and implicitly had no knowledge. But this is a man who's now come back out on the defense. What is his aim here? That's what people want to know.
And just finally, Layla, can you tell us, because he's been hammering on about this inquiry for quite a long time, do we know when the inquiry is meant to be to conclude?
Good question. We don't. This is an inquiry that's been pushed back by several weeks, and this is also due to the fact that new evidence and new allegations keep on surfacing. We know now that Dominic Cummings, his former aide, who stepped forward to say that he will swear under oath, is also going to be interviewed by Sue Gray and is also going to present evidence to Sue Gray. So we don't necessarily know. Earlier on this week, it was believed that by next week, the public would know something. But right now, that's still up in the air. We just have to wait and see.
All right, reporting live from Downing Street, Layla Johnson, Salami, thank you so much for joining the program this afternoon.